Let's discuss Lebanon and Iran and those fractious negotiations that are going on. There was a partial ceasefire between Israel and the Iran-backed group Hezbollah. It appears to be holding so far. Strikes have continued in southern Lebanon, but not in the capital Beirut after an announcement late last night from Donald Trump, who stepped in. There were reports, actually, that he emerged having the U.S. president berating Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over strikes and their impact on the peace negotiations he's trying to conduct with Iran. Let's talk now to Dan Arbell, scholar in residence at the Center for Israeli Studies at the American University and a former Israeli diplomat. Good evening, Dan.
Good evening. Good to be here.
Thanks for joining us. What do you know of this call that occurred between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu last night?
Well, it sounds, according to reports, that it was a very contentious call, very tense. Not a lot of agreement there between the two leaders, and basically Donald Trump telling Netanyahu that he expects him to fall in line and follow his guidance, if not to say orders, and a announced plan of Israel to attack in the Dahia suburb of Beirut was just reversed as a result of this phone call. The IDF was ready to conduct these strikes in Dahia suburb against Hezbollah targets there. And right after that phone call, all those plans were put back in the drawer.
So can it be taken from that the demands of Donald Trump are heeded in Israel?
Yes, in the last 24 hours, we've seen that they're definitely heated and that the IDF is not planning anything at this moment. And clearly, this was an Israeli interest to strike these targets of Hezbollah. As you mentioned, these tensions have been brewing for several weeks, and despite the fact that it's officially a ceasefire, it's anything but a ceasefire. It's called a ceasefire, but the fire doesn't cease.
Right.
And so Israel is not certainly was intending to hit these targets, and now that it's not, it's undermining Israeli interests.
So how serious then are the talks between Israel and Lebanon? Are they just pure window dressing, or do they have any serious intents for some sort of solution, resolution, or new relationship between the two countries?
But the original intention for this was positive, and I think the idea of Lebanon and Israel talking after so many years is a good thing. But these talks, as you can see, are kind of being held in some parallel universe in which there's no fighting and there's no tensions and there are no mutual strikes. And these talks are leading to nowhere. And I honestly don't know what the agenda is of these talks and what the expected outcome is. For the first time in many years, there's a government in Lebanon which is serious about having talks with Israel and wanting to normalize ties, or at least to reach a situation where there's no war. Doesn't mean necessarily immediately peace. And Israel was hoping that this would be an opportunity to try and launch these talks and weaken Hezbollah and those who support Hezbollah, who argue that the resistance against Israel must continue. Unfortunately, we're seeing that these talks are not leading to any concrete results, and they're happening as we speak once again. To what point, I wonder.
And so how connected then are depending on how well the negotiations, and obviously they not seem to be going very far, very fast, but is the behavior of Hezbollah very much dependent on the status of the relationship of the talks between America and Iran? So essentially, Iran can determine what Hezbollah gets up to and instructs it accordingly.
Yes, what we've seen in the last few weeks is the Lebanon becoming a prominent issue on the agenda of the U.S. and Iran. Iran insists that any accommodation reached between the U.S. and Iran also includes a ceasefire in Lebanon in which Hezbollah can continue operating and so on. Israel opposes the inclusion of Lebanon in any future U.S.-Iranian agreement. And therefore, so we see this push and pull. The U.S. wants to advance the talks with Iran, and wants Israel not to interrupt, and so not to bother it with the Lebanese issue, as the U.S. is trying to looking at the big picture and trying to get to a deal with Iran, which is multifaceted. Iran, as I said, insists on it. And Israel just seems to be, in the eyes of the Trump administration, undermining its efforts.
And who's in a greater impatience for this deal to come to fruition, or who's got the long, who can last longer in these talks between the US and Iran? Because I mean, Donald Trump was yesterday just talked about finding them very boring now, I think was his comment, that he's almost just finding it all rather too tedious to keep talking to them. Could it just collapse entirely?
Yeah, yes, they could collapse entirely, but definitely the interest of the parties themselves. It's hard to measure who wants it more, but certainly they both really want this. Trump, I live here in Washington, and I can tell you, gas prices are spiraling, are very high.
Mm.
Cost of living is high. Certainly, the Strait of Hormuz impasse is impacting the U.S. economy and the broader world economy. And Trump doesn't want this to wants to end this. He wants to move on to other things that he's dealing with. For Iran, Iran is buying time as the negotiations are dragging along. But I'm sure that the Iranians do not want another U.S. and Israeli combined strike or a resumption of war. So, a ceasefire or reaching an agreement serves both sides, and now they've been bickering over or arguing over the terms of such a deal.
And domestically in Israel, how does Netanyahu ride these waves? Does he face criticism internally if he's seen to acquiesce towards Trump, or is it humiliating for him, or is that just something he doesn't need to worry too much about for a domestic audience?
There's widespread criticism of how Netanyahu is handling this. Netanyahu, when he was the head of the opposition a few years ago, criticized then the Prime Minister Naftali Bennett for not saying no to the U.S. President Joe Biden, and said that any Israeli Prime Minister has to know one thing: saying no to a U.S. president. And here we have Netanyahu doing the exact opposite. He cannot say no to U.S. presidents. Certainly, this is not easy for him domestically. This is hurting his image, hurting him in the polls, and making his opponents use this, and present him as a weak leader who cannot just stand and defend Israeli interests.
And with elections due in October, might there be pressure then on Netanyahu to, whatever Trump asks of him, or whatever restraint Trump is asking of Netanyahu, to go against that and to show his strength through force in Lebanon?
Yeah, that's an option, but also we have to remember Netanyahu has put all his eggs in one basket. That is a basket of Donald Trump. And he depends on Trump not only strategically, but also for his political, personal considerations. He hopes that continued pressure by Trump on the Israeli president to pardon him and end his trial would continue. And so, Netanyahu has subordinated his personal agenda, and has basically brought to a situation in which he really depends on Trump. So he hopes Trump will pay him back ahead of the elections. If that doesn't work, he may, as you suggest, may decide to, just show that he does have a backbone and he does protect Israeli interests, and may launch continued attacks on Hezbollah.
Okay. Really interesting. We'll keep a close eye on it all, as always, of course. Dan Arbell, thanks so much indeed. That's Dan
Thank you.
Arbell, scholar in residence at the Center for Israeli Studies at the American University.